This is LibreQuest. My name is Matt. The date is the 2nd October 2019. First article that I have today has to do with the Ubuntu kernel. Canonical outs major Linux kernel security patch for Ubuntu 18.04 and 16.04. This article is posted on October 1st, 2019 by Marius Nestor. Canonical released today a new Linux kernel security patch for its long-term supported Ubuntu 18.04 and Ubuntu 16.04. The new Linux kernel security update fixed two vulnerabilities, the CVE 2018-20976 and CVE 2019-15538 in the Linux 4.15 kernel, used both in Ubuntu 18.04 and 16.04, discovered in the XFS file system, which could allow a local attacker to either execute arbitrary code or cause a denial of service attack. The CVE 2018-20976 issue was also fixed in the Linux 4.4 kernel. As for the security issues addressed in Linux 4.4 kernel used on some Ubuntu 16.04 LTS systems, we can mention a race condition CVE 2016-10905 and the GFS2 file system, an integer overflow CVE 2019-11487 in the Linux kernel discovered when referenced accounting pages. I apologize, it's actually when reference counting pages. That makes more sense, not accounting. As well as a race condition CVE 2019-15215 and the CPIA2 video for Linux device driver. So this is good news, and this is from Softpedia News. And that title again is Canonical outs major Linux kernel security patch for Ubuntu 18.04 and 16.04. So I covered an article yesterday about Docker. And this is a new article that was posted on October 1st that I did not see. This article, I do not see who wrote this article, but you can find it over at itprotoday.com. It says, no matter what you've heard, the Docker container ship is not sinking, although the memo does indicate that the company is needing some cash to tide it over or help it expand. This situation doesn't seem to indicate that the Docker container can't weather the storm. Oh, and I apologize. This article is written by Christine Hall. I just overlooked the author's name there. According to some press reports around a leaked memo from Docker's CEO to its employees, the open source company that all but invented the container technology boosting cloud growth for the last 5 years or so is facing hard times. Although the memo does indicate that the company is needing some cash to tide it over or help it expand, the situation doesn't seem to indicate that Docker container can't weather the storm. As shared at the last all-hands meeting, we have been engaging with investors to secure more financing to continue to execute on our strategy, Rob Bearden, Docker CEO since May, wrote in an email that was sent to company employees. I wanted to share a quick update on where we stand. We are currently in active negotiations with two investors and are working through final terms. We should be able to provide you a more complete update within the next couple of weeks. It's not like those following the company don't have good reason to suspect that the "we need money" mantra is leading to Docker's final resting place in Davy Jones's locker. The company took more than a few detours as it searched for the route to monetization, with leadership problems arising along the way as well. Bearden, for example, who was CEO at the open source big data company Hortonworks before it merged with Cloudera last year, is the fourth CEO in Docker's short history and the third since 2017. Again, if you want to read the rest of this article, it's over at IT Pro Today. The next article is how to install Atom Editor on Ubuntu. Atom is a free and open source text editor that is modern, approachable, and hackable to the core. With so many other text editors available, why should we go for Atom? Editors like Sublime and TextMate offer convenience, only limited extensibility. On the other end of the spectrum, Emacs and Vim offer extreme flexibility, but they aren't very approachable and can be customized with special purpose scripting languages. However, the Atom developers have an aim for zero compromise combination of hackability and usability, an editor that will be welcoming to an elementary school student on their first day learning to code, but also a tool they won't outgrow as they develop into seasoned hackers. In this article, we will explain how you can install the latest stable and beta versions of the Atom editor on your Ubuntu. So in the article, it explains that if you use Ubuntu, you can use the Ubuntu Package Manager to install Atom Editor. If you search for Atom Editor, it will bring up Atom, and you can install it using that method. Also, you can install it as a snap with sudo snap install. And lastly, it covers that you can use wget from the packagecloud.io/atom editor/atom/gpg key. Okay, that is awesome. So you get the key from there, and you can install it that way as well. If you want to read this article is located over at vitux.com. That's vitux.com. And that is all I have on the articles for today. So thank you for listening today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the build that I'm working on. It's the build using the HP Pro 6300 motherboard. Now for this build, I wanted to have a CD-ROM and DVD-ROM combo drive, but I also wanted to have a floppy disk drive. And the reason for that is for installing and testing older operating systems on the machine. So one thing that's really great about this motherboard is, well, first, the bad things about the motherboard, it is BTX, which means a limited amount of expansion ability. Also, there are BIOS issues. Unfortunately, unlike a BTX you would get from, let's say, Dell, HP did not offer the ability to turn off certain ports if you wanted to. So that generates boot errors unless you do something to mitigate that problem. And I intend to do a podcast and some content about how I've mitigated that issue on my specific system here. But the good thing about this motherboard is that it's certified to run Linux. When it was released, it was certified to run SLED 11, so that's the SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop 11. Now, I know that's an older version, but that's still really cool that it's certified to run Linux. So it's a Linux native motherboard, and I just think that is really cool. So I had an issue with fitting that motherboard into the system where the drive tray for the floppy disk is. So what I mean by drive tray, it's the part where you'll screw the floppy disk drive into, and now that part can be removed, as traditionally in a computer case you can remove certain mounting mechanisms out of the computer case, or at least you used to be able to do that. And so thankfully on this case that part was removable. So I ended up having to modify that part, and the reason for that was it was interfering with where the cooling fan was for the processor on the board. And again, that's an LGA 1155. I always want to say LG, probably because of the company LG, but it is LGA 1155 processor socket. So, and I said socket. That is so funny. I'm sorry, that is so funny. Anyway, I'm just going to forget that I said that, and we'll move on. So yeah, that part was interfering with where the cooling fan for the CPU was. So what I ended up having to do was I ended up having to modify that part. And so what I did was I used a metal cutting wheel for, I guess you would call it a wheel, or just a metal cutting blade attachment for my Dremel tool. And the reason that I went that route was because if you're cutting through metal, there's many different methods you can use to cut through metal. You can even use some kind of like a 10 snip or something like that. But you run into several issues. That leaves the surface of the cut very sharp, which makes it unsafe to work with later if you're going to go back through and maybe add in a different motherboard, or add in an RTX 2080 Ti that's liquid cooled, or you know, something cool that maybe you want to do later. And And, you know, initially I didn't want to modify this case too much. I wanted to keep it as original as possible. So this is one of the very few modifications on the case that I actually have done. But for what I wanted to do right now, I actually had to do this modification. So I removed a small section of the bottom part of that mount for the floppy disk drive. And again, what I was trying to explain was the reason that I used that metal cutting wheel on the Dremel is because I didn't want to have to bend and reshape that metal after I made that cut. And so this was just for me, the natural choice to go that route with it. Now it is a very thin metal, of course, because it's not as thin as some of the cases you can get today. I have a Rosewill case, and that metal is very, very thin, but this is a little bit hardier than that, but it's not a very thick metal, and it's very easy to cut through. But the point is, the reason I went with the Dremel tool is because I wanted to preserve the shape of the metal and not have to bend it around too much and rework it back into shape. So a Dremel just made sense to me to use it for that application. So the second thing that I did was I went over that cut that I had made afterwards with a sanding bit on the end of the Dremel tool. Now that was just to remove any burrs and any sharp edges off of there, because if I'm going to be working around in that case, I don't want to cut my hands. That's an important consideration to make when you're working inside of a computer case. Now, something else on the floppy disk drive is there was an issue, and that issue is that the floppy disk interface does not come standard on motherboards these days, and there was no controller for that on the motherboard that I had. So I was trying to decide what I was going to do in regard to the floppy disk drive, because nobody uses a floppy disk drive anymore. Or I mean, I do. I still see value in them, and their long life, or at least proposed long life, as long as you store them properly. And also because to me it's kind of cool to be able to have a very small storage medium that doesn't have moving parts, that doesn't have any chips, any additional failure points. The only real failure point is if you don't store it properly, I would think, or if you put it next to a magnet, of course, because it is magnetic tape. But also the advertised lifespan or life expectancy of magnetic tape is really, really high, and they're still being used in production today in nuclear facilities, apparently. And I'm not sure if you read that article, but I think that came out a few months ago. Maybe it was longer than that. I don't exactly remember, but that's pretty impressive for any kind of storage to last that long. So I found on eBay, ordered it from eBay. I found a converter, and it converts the floppy disk interface over to USB. Now it's a USB 2 device, so you plug that into your USB port, and not only does it interface for data, but it also has a power output, which I was completely stoked about, because that means that you just plug your power wire harness into the back of this converter, and then you plug the other end into your drive. Now, unfortunately, mine, when they shipped it out to me, it did not have that wire power harness in there, unfortunately. So I did have to make my own, and I used my DuPont connector kit, and I've included, if you're watching the video, I've included some pictures of my DuPont connector kit, my crimp tool, and the 28 AWG wire that I'm using. So if you're thinking, what in the world is a DuPont connector kit? I've included pictures of those just for that very purpose. But the crimp tool was actually pretty expensive. I really avoid spending a lot of money. It's not something that I really enjoy doing, especially for something like a crimp. It's a very nice crimp tool, but it was like $30, and to me that seemed like a very high price for such a seemingly simple tool. But that kit has come in so handy in so many different situations. especially if you work on Raspberry Pi, Arduino, something along those lines, or you just like to modify stuff or fix things, I would highly recommend getting yourself a DuPont connector kit. Now, if you're watching the video, you saw mine. It is kind of a mess, but I guess that just happens sometimes. Anyway, that is all I had for today. I thank you for listening, and I thank you for watching as well. And I hope you have a good rest of your day, or rest of your morning, rest of your evening, or whatever time it might be. And I will see you back here tomorrow, or you will hear me back here tomorrow if you're listening to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.